Welcome to another B.Hooked tutorial. My name is Brittany, and today I'm going to teach you how to tackle the Karen Adult Knit V-Neck Cardigan. This is a free pattern that's available from Yarnspirations.com. Well, in this tutorial, I'll blend a mix of knitting techniques and pattern reading concepts to help you turn this beauty into a finished project. Let's begin with the basics first. Well, now we have a pretty good understanding of how we need to knit up all of our panels following the pattern, but there are a few other techniques we need to learn in order to finish up our decreases. Now we're going to run into 4 different techniques when we work on the raglan decreases, and some of us will have to use them more than others. It just depends on the size that you're making. But in the case of the sleeve, when you get to that point, we all have to work 4 techniques: the slip, slip, knit, the knit 2 together, the purl 2 together, and the purl 2 together through the back loop. So we're going to cover all 4 of those next. And here I have my little mini sleeve here. I've already worked the first 2 stitches, and I'm ready to do the slip, slip, knit. So when your pattern calls for a slip, slip, knit, you're simply going to slip 2 stitches knitwise. And what I mean by that is you're going to insert your needle into the stitch as if you were going to knit it. But instead of following through with the stitch, you're just going to pass it from one needle to the next. Then you're going to do that for the next stitch as well. So you'll slip that. And now you'll take your opposite needle and work it underneath both of those 2 slipped stitches. And then you're set up to knit. And you can pass them off. And that's what it looks like. So it has a left lean to it, and it continues our raglan decreases. When you get to the point in your pattern where it tells you to knit 2 together, this is going to be a right-leaning decrease for us right-handed knitters and opposite for left-handed knitters. Well, all we need to do is isolate those 2 stitches, so I'm just covering up the rest with my fingers, and I insert my needle knitwise into both stitches as if it were one. So it looks like a normal knit, but I'm just catching both of those loops rather than one and knitting as we normally would. That's all there is to the knit 2 together. It's a very simple stitch. Now when you get to the point in your pattern where it tells you to purl 2 together, and just a little tip here, it's always going to be on a purl row. Well, what you'll do is keep your working yarn at front like you would if you were doing just a normal purl stitch. You'll isolate those next 2 stitches and insert your needle under both of them, purlwise. So just like that. And then you'll purl the stitch like you would as if it were one. Now the last of the 4 techniques that you'll need to know to do your raglan shaping and then just throughout the pattern in general is the purl 2 together through the back loop. So how do we work that? Well, what we want to do is we want to get to the point in the pattern where we need to work the purl 2 together through the back loop, and then we're going to isolate the next 2 stitches, the 2 that we're going to work together, and then we need to do things a little bit backwards. We're still taking our normal needle in from back to front, but we're not going in from the usual direction. If we were purling 2 together, just like we saw before, we would be working under those 2 there. Well, when you're going through the back loop, what you need to do, I'm just going to turn this so you can see where I'm placing it. You don't actually physically have to turn your needles like this, but you're going to find those same 2 stitches, so this one and this one, and I am going to work it in through those 2 stitches there, so kind of like how my needles are pointing in that same direction, and then just twist it into place. Now this can get a little bit tight, so you do want to make sure that you slip your needle so that it's fully in place before you purl it off as if it were a normal stitch. Now it feels different because when you're purling it off, the stitch is essentially twisted. So you just want to watch the placement of your needle and then purl it off. Slide that off your needle. Well, at this point, you have all the tools that you need to know to be able to start knitting your left front and your right front. Starting with page 2, of course, you can work these in any order that you want. I started with the left front because I just followed along directly with the pattern. And you're going to follow along just like before. We're going to work a similar ribbing pattern, but it's not identical. That's the main point that I want to hit here. Even though a lot of the panels are very, very similar, they're not exactly identical and they aren't exactly opposite. The left front and the right front are a perfect example. I had in my head that the right front was going to be basically the exact opposite of the left front, right? That makes logical sense to me. But what I found is that in looking at the pattern, they are slightly different. There are subtle differences. You're going to see differences here in the first and second row, the repeat for the ribbing. The sizes are going to be the same, so most of this is going to be the same, and your raglan shaping is going to be different. So just keep that in your mind that these panels, although very similar, are not identical and they're not exactly opposite. So what I need for you to do now is knit the following panels. We're going to knit the left panel, and then we're going to knit the right panel. You can work these in any order, it really doesn't matter. Just make sure that you're keeping the pattern straight and you're following the instructions as they're given to you in the pattern. After you've knit the left panel and the right panel, we'll have a look at what those look like so you know that you're on the right track. And the next thing we're going to tackle are the sleeves. So let's talk about those. The next thing we're going to talk about are the sleeves. Now you can find the start of the instructions for the sleeve here on page 4 of your pattern. That's going to be your ribbing instruction. So let's have a look at that because there is a repeat here. It doesn't actually tell us exactly what we're supposed to do for our ribbing. So our first row and our second row repeat. What it says is work 2.5 inches in knit 2, purl 2 ribbing as given for the back. That is the bit of information we really need to take away from this paragraph. That tells us that although we're going to be working with a different set of numbers, so different cast on numbers, we're going to work the ribbing in the same repeat that we saw back for the back panel of the cardigan. The next thing we're going to notice is that it gives us another situation where we need to increase stitches evenly across the last row. So just keep that in mind. Techniques are the same that we covered for the back, but just don't skip over that step. And then we see our final stitch count number, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Now here on page 6, we see the bulk of the instructions for the sleeve. We've already covered the techniques that we need to know to actually work the sleeve. But the most confusing part, I think that's really going to trip people up, is the instructions. So we're going to go over exactly how to read through this pattern, to weed through all of the information that we're given here, and only focus on what we need. So after we've worked that first paragraph on the previous page, on page 4, we've worked through the ribbing, we've increased as we were instructed. The next thing we're going to do is follow the instructions here. We're going to change to our larger needle size, and we're going to work 6 rows in stockinette stitch. Now, we're going to just follow right along with the next paragraph. Ask yourself, am I making this for a female? If so, this is going to be your next step. If not, you're going to cross it off and move on. Now the next paragraph. I see that medium and large sizes are given here. So this is for these 2 sizes only. Ask yourself, am I making a medium? Am I making a large? If the answer is yes, follow through with these instructions. If the answer is no, cross it off and move on. Now this little guy right here is hiding a little bit. It's easy to overlook that. This is going to be your next step no matter what because it's all sizes. You're going to continue working even, which continue even, that's your stitch pattern, the stockinette stitch. No increases, no decreases. We're just evenly knitting until our work measures one of these lengths. So you'll pick out your length and end on a purl row. Now ask yourself, am I making this cardigan for a male? If so, this is going to be your next step. If not, you're going to cross it off and move on. Then the last little piece you're going to Workup is continue even, again in stockinette stitch, no increases, no decreases, until your work measures whatever length for the size that you're working on. So circle your size, that's your length, work it up to that point. Now that is actually the bulk of the sleeve, but we have to move on to the raglans. So we're just going to follow the instructions as we have been doing. The raglan shaping for the sleeves, as you can see, is a lot less complicated. We're just going to follow it step by step until we finish that off. We're going to cast off and we're going to work another sleeve in the same exact way. So you'll knit your first sleeve, you'll knit your second sleeve. At that point, you have your front and back panels completed and your sleeves. So at that point, the last thing we need to cover are the finishing techniques. Now, while we're on the topic of sleeves, there's one other little technique. We've technically already covered it, but I want to point it out because we worked our increases and we spaced them evenly throughout the row. That was what we covered when we were looking at the back section. Well, we do have to do that for the sleeve. So down here, right at the very end of the ribbing where the ribbing meets the stockinette. But then later on, we have to increase at the end of a certain number of rows. So I'm going to demonstrate the same increasing technique, but since we're on the edge here, I just want to make sure that you see it in real time. That way you actually know how to work it. So when you increase at the end of a row, you can't increase off the very last stitch. You just don't have anything to work from. So I went ahead and knit the whole row until I had one stitch remaining, and then I'm looking at that bar right here. That's what I'm going to grab with my main needle here and then place it on my other needle. Then I'm going to work that needle through the back loop of that little stitch there and just knit like normal. So we're doing a make one. That's no different. The difference here is just the placement of it. So I'm going to knit the last stitch. And the wording is a little bit, well, it can be a little bit tricky. I recommend doing your increases on knit rows. That's going to make sure that the stitches look nice and even and pretty. This make one works out really well when you're doing so. Well, you're going to have to increase. It says to increase at the end of the next row and then every 6 rows. So what I have done is I have counted this as my increase row. Then the next row, I'm going to flip it over and purl all the stitches. That is going to count as my first row. Then I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when I get to that 6th row, I should end up on a knit side or on the right side of the work, and I can do my increases again. Now, one little tip I have for you is to read the pattern very carefully. I actually looked over this really important detail the very first time around. It says that we need to increase at the beginning and end of these rows. So I just want to demonstrate what it looks like to do a make one at the beginning. I'm going to just knit one stitch so I have something to work with. I can see that top bar, grab it, place it on your needle, and knit it through that back loop to increase 1. So don't be fooled by that. Make sure you read your instructions very carefully. Now at this point, you can almost taste the success. We are almost finished. We just have a few finishing techniques to cover. We'll have a look at those next, but I do want to point out and just break this down a little bit. Finishing, of course, begins here on page number 5, but it involves 3 different techniques. 2 of which are given in your pattern. One of them is a recommendation just for me personally from experience. So the first thing we're going to do for the finishing is to sew the seams. We're going to sew the raglan seams, we're going to sew the sides, and basically stitch the entire thing together. We're going to have a look at that technique first. Then what we need to do, step number 2 for the finishing, is to work on the band. So the button band, we're actually going to knit this and sew it into place as we knit, which is a super cool technique. Anytime I can get away from a darning needle and seaming, That's the route I want to take. So I'm really glad this pattern incorporates that, and I can teach you this technique because you can use it for any pattern. Now, the third thing that we're going to do for the finishing is block. And I'm actually going to situate that so that it's up here. We want to do that first. We want to wet block all 5 of our panels before we can sew and before we can add the band. As you can see by looking at your panels, they're probably curling and rolly and maybe a little bit wobbly. Well, the best way to make your work look professional and something that you actually want to wear is to block it. I do have a resource available on wet blocking your project. It is specifically for crochet, but the techniques are exactly the same. You can find that resource at bhookedcrochet.com/blockyourproject. That is going to show you a couple different techniques for blocking, but the main thing I want you to focus in on is the wet blocking. So wet block all 5 of your panels. We're going to have a look now in the studio at how to sew the seams together. We're going to follow that up with a button band and how to do buttonholes, and we're going to wrap this thing up. So the first thing you need to do is place 2 of your panels together. So I have one of my front pieces and my sleeve, and I'm going to sew this raglan seam initially. So grab yourself a darning needle. I really like to have the bent tip from Clover. I think they work really well for stitching sweaters together. And a nice long piece of yarn. And the first thing I'm going to do is just do that initial attachment here at the bottom. So I'm going to find my first stitch. Remember, we casted off 2 stitches there, so I'm just catching one of those on each side. Now this is actually going to be under the arm, so if it doesn't look perfect, it's perfectly okay. And then I'm going to go back in the other direction for that second stitch that was cast off. So on this side, and then bring that through to the other side. Now, once you have those 2 stitches taken care of, the first thing we need to do is establish where we're going to start our seam. So look at your work. We can see that we have 2 very distinct lines, like diagonal lines from our decreases. And then we have kind of a selvage edge right here. Well, if you place your needle directly in between this edge, so this line of stitches, and the edge, we're going to find a vertical bar right there. And that's where I want to make my first stitch. Then I'm going to jump over to the other side and then just get myself set up so I can see the same thing. So I've got my 2 vertical lines. I have my selvage or my edge stitch there. And then insert my needle in between, catch the bar, and work across. Find the next bar up, and then jump across. Now you can pull it tight as you go, or you can leave it a little bit loose and we can tighten it all at once. Whatever's comfortable for you. The main thing is that we're doing 1 stitch at a time. We're really taking our time here. That's the key to having pretty seams, is not rushing through it, and consistency in your placement. So I'm always catching that bar that's in between those stitches. And when I'm on one side, I'm going to just jump directly up to the next bar on the same side. And then I go across to the other side. Now once you get a few stitches worked, you can just pull real tight on that. You don't want to pull it through. But did you see how those 2 rows just went together perfectly? That is our goal here. Now once you've made it all the way up, you want to make sure that you pull that, your tail there, and pull that nice and tight. It'll pull your seam together. And make sure that it's nice and closed. You don't have a big open gap or anything like that. The other thing I want to point out is that if your decreases here, if your pieces don't match up exactly, it's not too big of a deal. So the main reason why mine didn't match up perfectly here is because, well, I'm working on a mini version. I just did some really rough math calculations to shrink this size. And so what I'm going to do is just incorporate any of this extra in the shoulder seam here. So if that's the case for you, don't be alarmed. Just continue to make sure it aligns throughout the part that's actually visible, and any leftover you can just deal with and work that into the seam. Now that you have the general idea of how to seam up your raglan seams, well, there's another seam that we're going to have to tackle too, and that's kind of like a raw edge seam. So what I have here is my sleeve, and there's 2 different stitch patterns. Of course, we have the ribbing down at the bottom, and then we're seaming 2 stockinette sides together. The techniques are basically the same. The concept from stitching together the raglan seams and these raw edges, but I want to just give you the opportunity to see it in action once again so that you just know exactly what you need to do. It's a little bit different for the ribbing, but the first thing you want to do, of course, is thread your darning needle. Now, I actually left my tail nice and long so I could use that to seam it up, and that's a little tip if you can do that or know that ahead of time. I'm just first going to go into that edge stitch over on the opposite side and pull it through. And then I'm going to follow that same general concept. So I have a raw edge here that's next to a knit row, and then over here this is like my purl edge. So what I'm going to do is insert my needle in that next bar that's right on top of where I just joined the 2 sides together, and then I can jump over to the other side. Now the most important thing is that you're consistent in your placement. Grab that bar and pull, then go up just 1 row above, pull that together, and then jump over to the other side. Go up once again and over, and we're just going to keep repeating this over and over until we're at least finished with the ribbing. Now I'm simply going to pull that so I can tighten up that little section there, and it pulls it together real nicely. It kind of looks like a purl, so it maintains our pattern, which is what we want. Now, when you get to the stockinette part, the same general rules apply. We're going to find our edge here. So this is my nice, neat row, and then I have my edge. I want to go in between those and catch that bar. We're looking for that same bar that we were using with the raglan seams. And same thing on the other side. Find your nice, pretty row, and then find your edge and go directly in between those to find that bar. And again, work 1 row up before you jump over to the other side. The next technique we're going to cover is the button band, and there are several different techniques within this little piece, but it is kind of like the last piece of the puzzle here. So you're going to direct your attention to page 5 of the pattern and follow the first 2 rows to cast on for the button band. They're 2 very simple rows using knits and purls, and the next thing you'll need to have in place is your cardigan, of course. So I have some of the seams worked already. Of course, I don't have the side seams. I just have the raglan seams. And I want to find the side that coordinates with the gender I'm working on. So I'm making this for a female. So I'm going to be working on the left front, and that's where I'm going to attach my button band. Now I have these 2 rows worked. I have my tail coming from here. I'm going to use this to secure it to the very bottom corner of this left front panel. So what I want to do is focus my attention on that panel and jump 1 or 2 rows up. You can really work it either way. You'll take your needle now, and we are working on the smaller of the 2 needles. You'll take that and just simply insert it into the side of that selvage stitch on the edge. And then pass your first stitch over knitwise. So insert your needle knitwise and then slip it over. Now that stitch is going to get loose, and that's okay. Just pull on your working yarn, it'll tighten it up. And then what we need to do is work our needle underneath that selvage stitch, and we're just going to pass this over this. Kind of similar to that casting off technique, but we're not really casting off, we're just slipping this over. Now once you have that stitched over on that other side, you're just going to pass it back over to your needle so that you can work it. And then we're just going to follow along with the pattern repeat. So we'll pick back up with row number 1. So we'll knit that first stitch, knit the second stitch, and then do our ribbing repeat here. Now once you have that first row completed, just go ahead and make sure that you have the correct number of stitches casted on, and then we're simply going to flip it over and work row 2 of our pattern repeat. Now once you've worked that second row, this is what your work should look like. Then we're just going to flip it back over, and we've covered our repeat now. So every time we are on the right side of the work, so when we're looking at the right side of our cardigan, we're going to slip the first stitch like we just did, and that's how we're kind of sewing in place as we go. So we're not going to have any nasty seams or have to deal with the darning needle after we get through this step. When you get to the point where you need to add your buttonholes, our instructions tell us to work through the first 4 stitches in our ribbing pattern, and then we're going to cast off 2. So we're going to continue doing so in pattern. So my next stitch here is a purl, so that means I need to purl that, and then I'm going to pass this stitch over. So I've casted off 1 stitch there. Then I'm going to work the next stitch, which is a knit, and pass this over to cast off. And that is 2 stitches cast off. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue to the end of the row. Now you'll work your second row until you get to the point where you have that gap, that 2-stitch gap. And then we need to cast on 2 stitches in the beginning of the row. So what I like to do is just take the working yarn, hold it in my opposite hand, place my thumb over it, and spin it around, and then pick up that strand. So that's 1 new stitch. We'll do that again. Now I can continue working with my pattern. And now when you work your next row, you have 2 stitches. You're going to work in them just like normal, the 2 that we just added. And then of course you have your little buttonhole. If you have any questions whatsoever, I'm here for you. Please don't hesitate to leave your questions in the comments section at bhookedcrochet.com/V-Neck Cardigan. If you found this tutorial helpful, be sure to tell me by hitting that like button, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Well, I look forward to serving you in the next episode at B.Hooked. Cheers!